I thought today I'd do a tutorial on binding and how to put your binding on, how to turn the corner, and how to finish the binding. You know how often people will take the two ends of the binding and just stuff them into each other and sew over it and call it good. Well, that isn't the greatest way to finish your binding. This way that I'm going to show you today works pretty nicely because you really can't tell where you've started and stopped your binding. This is the technique that my daughter always calls me at midnight because she's trying to finish up a quilt and she can't remember how to finish the binding, and I always walk her through it over the telephone, which is not the easiest, but she's got it now. Of course, we could FaceTime, which I hadn't thought about that, now that we have that nice little tool to just FaceTime with somebody. But anyway, today I'm going to show you binding. This is a quilt. I've got the binding most of the way around. This is done out of Moda's book, Go Big for Your Home. I love the book. I think this is the third or fourth one that I've done out of that book. And of course, I like orange. You can see I have orange on today. I like orange, so I included some orange in it. So first I'm going to show you how to put the binding on and how to go around the corner. And we'll also talk today about how do you figure backing? How much backing do I need when my quilt is all done? So we'll do that too. Now I've cut my binding so that my strips are 2.5 inches wide. That's my preference unless I'm working on a very small quilt, but I prefer 2.5 inches. I've gone to the ironing board and I've ironed that in half. So I'm going to put my binding on the right side of my quilt. And, whoops, I just stitched when I didn't want to. So 1/4 inch away from my quilt, I'm going to sew that binding on. Now this is the key to making your binding wrap right around the corner. You want to stop 1/4 inch away from the edge of your quilt. Now my sewing machine presser foot actually has a little groove at the 1/4 inch mark. So I know where I can stop and be 1/4 inch away from the edge of my quilt. If your presser foot does not have that, then you're just going to have to eye it. But you can get used to it very quickly where the eye is, or where the 1/4 inch is. So I've stopped. You see? 1/4 inch away from my edge of my quilt. And I take the top right out of the machine. And then I'm going to take my binding and I'm going to bring it right straight up like this. And bring it right straight back down again. So the binding is actually folded over itself. And then because you've left 1/4 inch, you didn't go all the way to the edge of your quilt, you've left 1/4 inch. We're going to start stitching 1/4 inch away from our quilt. Because you haven't stitched that right straight into the corner, it's going to allow your binding to wrap around the corner of your quilt. So you can see, trim those threads. Now it's just going to wrap right around there. Look at that. Just beautifully. So that's how you're going to turn the corner on your binding. Okay, now I've sewn the binding most of the rest of the way down that side, and I'm going to show you how you can finish your binding. So I've left a healthy 6 inches or so between where I started my binding and where I just ended sewing. So I'm going to show you the next step to successfully having your binding be smoothless when you stop and start it. I'm going to trim this just a little bit. I don't want that amount of length. All right, now remember, we cut our binding 2.5 inches wide. So I've laid the binding on the right side. This is where I started, and the left side where I ended is on the left side. We're going to lay the right side right flat down where we started. We're going to take the left side and lay that directly over the strip where we started. Now remember, it was 2.5 inches wide, our binding. So what we're going to do, we're going to take our little ruler and we're going to line up 2.5 inches right where our binding that we started with is. So right from this point, and you can see it because the left side of your binding is over top of it, but you can still see it. So lay your ruler so that it's 2.5 inches, and we are going to cut it. Now, don't add anything, don't subtract anything. Cut it at 2.5 inches. I'm going to do a nice straight cut. If you cut it at 2.5 inches and don't add or subtract from that, your binding's going to lay nice and flat. So we're going to turn our binding so that the left side is facing right side up. In the left side, or I'm sorry, the right side where we started is right sides down. We're going to join them exactly the way you joined your binding on the diagonal. We're going to lay those two right on top of each other. So here's our left side where we ended, and this is our right side. So the right sides are together. We're going to put pins in there. The reason that you want to leave a little extra is so that you have some room at this point to be able to get your binding laid out. Like I said, my daughter used to call me at 11 o'clock at night, "Mom, how do I finish the binding? I can't remember." My mom made me a little tutorial, a little scrap where, I had a 6-inch square with binding on it. And because I had that visual, I was always able to figure it out. All right, we're going to bring the machine back over here. Okay, we're going to put the quilt back into the machine, and then we are going to sew our binding where we pinned it, corner to corner.
It was a great way to end the year.
Cut your threads, and then you're going to cut along your seam 1/4 of an inch away. Now open that up, and we're going to stitch. we're going to stitch this right down, again 1/4 of an inch. And then as you can see, oops, I got a little thread there. But there's where we stopped and started. So it looks just like the rest of your binding. Where's there another seam? Right here is one. So it looks just like the rest of it, so you can't tell where you stopped and started. Now often these days, we've been putting our binding on both sides by machine. I like to do this for quilts that are going to be in and out of the washing machine, used hard, or if you're just running into a pinch and you don't have a lot of time, this is a very quick way to sew your binding on. So I use Superior's Mono Poly thread. This is a clear thread. And Clover's binding clips. So these are just awesome. They're little binding clips that are going to hold your binding. So what we're going to do is we're going to put those binding clips, we're going to wrap the binding around to the back of the quilt. We're going to put a binding clip there. And what's going to happen is, because of where our binding clip is placed, we're going to stitch in the ditch right next to our binding on the right side of the quilt. But then when we look at the back, our stitching is going to be right along the edge of our binding. So it's a quick way to finish off your binding. As you can see, I now have binding clips along the edge of the quilt. The red side of the clip is on the right side of the quilt. And I've got my clear thread. It's kind of a bear to thread your machine because you can't see it. But it works. Just have a little bit of patience. So I removed my first binding clip and I'm going right down along the edge of the binding on the right hand side of my quilt. As I get closer, I'm going to remove the binding clip. And just keep stitching down. I'll take this out of the machine so that you can see. Well, it's going to be very difficult to see, but right along there is where my stitching is on the back side of my quilt. So it's a terrific, quick way. You can't see it on the front. So it's an awesome way to be able to finish your bindings quickly on the machine. Now I'm going to show you another little tidbit on how to figure your backings, how much you need for a backing when you get your backing or your quilt ready for backing. I have to be honest with you guys. I've already taped this once, and I was going to let it go, and I was going to put it on YouTube and see if anyone caught my mistakes. But the more I thought about it, I couldn't do it. I was too embarrassed. I do know math, and I said that I do know math. But the last time that I did this, I added wrong, and not once, but twice. So this time I'm going to try to do it correctly. So we're trying to figure out how much backing we need for our quilt. So let's say our quilt is 72 inches wide by 80 inches long. Now, if you're going to take your quilt to a long armor, or you're going to long arm it, we have a long arm rental machine here that you can rent by the hour to quilt your own quilts. So if you're gonna do it on a long arm, you need to add 4 inches all the way around the quilt. The reason for this is the backing needs to attach to the quilting frame at the top and at the bottom. If you don't have extra fabric, we can't get it attached to the frame, or you can't get it attached to the frame. You also need extras on the sides. Your batting usually is a little bigger than your top, and you need your backing because we have straps that we attach to each side of the quilt to hold that nice and taut so that you don't get any puckering in the back of your quilt. So let's say our quilt top is 72 by 80. So we've got to add 4 inches on each side. Now this is where I goofed the last time. I had 72 and 4 and 4 and I came up with 76. Obviously that's not right. So you've got 80 now for your width of your quilt, and 4 and 4. You've got 88 for the length. Now whenever I'm figuring how much fabric I need for something, I always use the figure of 40 inches for the width of my quilt. That way it gives me a little extra. Most fabric is 42 or 43. But if I figure 40 inches, I know I'm safe. So our quilt is 80 inches wide. So we're going to need 2 widths of the quilt, or of the fabric, to be able to cover the back of this quilt. So if we've got 40 inches over here and 40 inches over here, so we're going to need 2 widths of our fabric. So our length of our quilt is 88 inches. So if we figure 2 yards will give us 72. 2 yards in length will give us 72. That leaves us with 16 inches. We need another additional 16 inches of fabric. So that would be half a yard. So we've got 2.5 yards for this side of the quilt, and we need another 2.5 for that side. So a total of 5 yards of fabric to be able to do the back of this quilt that's 72 by 80. So that's the minimum amount of fabric that you're going to want to get. Now remember, when you sew your backings together, remove the salvages from your backing before you sew those together, because you don't want the salvages being quilted as part of your quilt, because the fabric, the stitching or the threads along that selvage they're tightly woven more so than the rest of your fabric, and when you wash and dry that fabric, that's going to react very differently than the rest of your fabric. And also, it can be a bear to quilt through when you've got it on your machine. So that's how you figure backing. There's also reference guides to be able to figure it. Some days I can do this in my head. Some days I have to draw a picture just like this to be able to figure it out. But that's the way I figure backing. There's many other ways, but that's what works for me when I do the math right. Then that works. Okay, so that's my little tutorial on binding and backing today.